Soon a man coming from the opposite direction met the pilgrims and asked them where they were going. To Mount Zion, they replied. At this answer, the stranger, whose name was Atheist, burst out laughing. There's no such place as Mount Zion, he sneered. I have been searching for 20 years and I have not found it. So now I'm going back to enjoy all the pleasures I denied myself in order to pursue my quest. Christian, looking at Hopeful, asked, Does this man speak the truth? Beware, answered Hopeful at once. He is one of the flatterers. In any case, didn't we see the gate of Mount Zion city from the Delectable Mountains? And aren't we supposed to be walking by faith towards it? Then Christian started to smile, delighted by Hopeful's reply, for he had posed the question simply to test his younger companion. At one in their rejection of Atheist, the pilgrims turned their backs on him and walked away. Before long, the man's mocking laughter could be heard no more. The air of the country through which the pilgrims had to travel next was noted for its soporific effect. Hopeful could hardly keep his eyes open and suggested that they should take a nap, but Christian reminded him of the shepherd's warning against sleeping on the enchanted ground. In order to keep awake and moving, Hopeful related the story of his past life. For many years I delighted in the follies of Vanity Fair, he began, but then I heard, first from others, and later from you and Faithful, that these things bring death and condemnation. For a time, I tried to suppress the solemn thoughts which these words conjured up, because sin and the company of my friends still attracted me, and the awareness that I was doing wrong brought such depths of misery that I couldn't bear it, not realizing that this was God's way of speaking to me. However, talking to good people, reading the Bible, hearing about someone's sickness or death, and many other circumstances kept reminding me of my own impending death and the judgment that would follow. Then I tried to reform by turning from my sins and performing many religious exercises, but I found no relief. For having rejected my former sins, I found myself committing new ones. Even my good deeds were spoiled by sinful elements, so my despair returned. Then I met Faithful, who told me I would never be saved unless I could possess the righteousness of a man who had never sinned. This man, he told me, was Jesus. Faithful also gave me a book and taught me how to pray to God for mercy. I read and prayed for a very long time without finding any release. Then, one day, when I was feeling sadder than ever before, I saw and talked with Jesus. Not with my bodily eyes and lips, but with my heart and understanding. He told me to believe and trust in him with all my heart, and promised me that he would receive me, however great my sins, and make me right with God. Then I began to cry out of sheer happiness, for now I understood how God could condemn the sin and justify the sinner. That moment I turned in shame and with loathing from my old life, and was filled with a longing to live a holy life, serving and loving my new prince. When Hopeful had finished his story, he and Christian turned round and noticed ignorance still in their wake. So they waited until he had caught up with them. Then, Although Ignorance made it clear that he didn't really want their company, the Pilgrims fell in beside him and tried to draw him into conversation by asking him about his standing before God. Ignorance replied that his goodness must make him acceptable to God. And when Christian challenged this, the lad persisted. Surely a good heart, good thoughts, and a good life are enough to please God. But, countered Christian, thinking you have these things is not the same as actually having them. Besides, good thoughts and behavior are only so if they agree with what God says on the matter. And in his book, we read that no one is good. But I'm not bad, protested Ignorance, and I believe that Christ died for sinners, and that it is he who, by his merits, makes my religious exercises acceptable to God. You have entirely missed the point, exclaimed Christian. It isn't our imperfect obedience that's acceptable to God. It's Christ's perfect obedience. His goodness, accepted by faith, covers all our sins. But that's tantamount to saying, trust Christ and do as you please, Ignorance protested. You are certainly living up to your name, sighed Christian. Can't you understand that saving faith produces love of God's name and word, his will and people, so that those who trust him will want to please him? Hopeful then made the point that no one could know God unless he chose to reveal himself to that person. But Ignorance scoffed at the idea of revelation. After that, Christian made one more effort to make the lad understand his true condition and urged him to turn to Jesus, by whose goodness alone he could hope to escape from condemnation. To this, Ignorance replied, "You're going too fast for me. I'll walk behind for a while." With these words, he slowed down, letting Christian and Faithful go on ahead together. As they walked along, the Pilgrims talked sadly about the fate of Ignorance and many like him, who thought their own goodness would save them. Such people, they agreed, did, from time to time, experience conviction of sin, but they stifled their feelings of guilt, not realizing that good could come out of them. At this point in the discussion, Christian was reminded of someone he had met years before. "Did you know a religious man called Temporary?" he asked Hopeful. "Yes, I did," his companion replied. "He was a neighbour to Turnback and lived in Graceless Town, 2 miles from Honesty." "That's the man," Christian agreed. "He began to feel the burden of his sin." "I know," Hopeful interposed, "for he lived 3 miles from me and often came and wept at my house. I felt sorry for him. Once he told me that he would even be prepared to become a pilgrim," Christian continued. "But then he met a man called Save Self, and I heard and saw very little of him after that." Then he asked Hopeful, "Why do you think it is that some people begin to feel miserable about their sinful state, but don't do anything about it?" "I think their consciences are touched," said Hopeful, "but their minds and wills are unchanged. They fear their punishment, but don't detest their offences." And so Christian continued. "They stopped thinking of God, death, and judgment as being subjects too painful to dwell on. Next, they stop all private and public practicing of their religion and start avoiding Christians, choosing instead the company of evil men, whose examples they soon copy. By this time, the pilgrims had completed their journey across the enchanted ground and arrived at the borders of a country more delightful than any they had ever seen.